So we're going to turn to you guys now and open the floor for questions. Those of you who are at tables, please use your mics, and there are some roaming mics around the room. Just as we're gathering our thoughts, if you have a question, do turn your tent card up so that I can spot you. Let me open us up here with the first question. So first of all, thank you so much for those presentations, all very different, but some real common threads that I couldn't help but pick up on, which is that in innovative partnerships, there's an inherent deal of risk. And those partnerships need to be able to endure hurdles and barriers and challenges. Could you perhaps say a few words, each of you, on what are the prerequisite conditions for an innovative partnership really to survive those hurdles, and not only to survive, but to thrive? Who would like to jump in on us first here?
I'll go first. Thanks. I think the value of any kind of partnership is that all parties are benefiting from it. I think sometimes the word partnership is being thrown around a lot, and it's not necessarily equal. I kind of refer back to some of my background in the commercial space, where it's not uncommon for an organization like UPS to line up with a Merck or Johnson & Johnson and these large global organizations and sit down in the room with the executive team and talk about what's your vision for 5 years, what's important for you, where are your challenges, where do we help you with those challenges, here's where our challenges are. We may be going to the same market together. We may have to develop a new solution. We may have to look for a new revenue stream. There may be an acquisition involved. That candor and that open dialogue about what partnership is all about, and then both will benefit from the expansion, is what I think really makes sense. And I think that needs to carry over, and I know it does in this space also.
Thank you.
So I'm going to hark back to what Professor Sir George Alleyne said yesterday, and I should declare an interest. So Chamberlain, as we called him, was my professor when I was in the University of the West Indies. He was called Champ because he won everything. He said that he saw three things as important in creating partnerships. One was mutuality of intent, a common goal there. Clear community of purpose. And thirdly, a real sense of what the budget was, a shared sense of what the budget should be. And I think there's a good deal of sense in those three. What I would say is, in the same way that I felt the need to partition the sectors to understand what their issues were, I think those three things have to apply to each of the sectors that are engaged.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I have Sir George's notes here in front of me because I thought it was one of the most crisp ways of communicating that I'd heard. Amanda?
Yeah, I think this has been said before, trust being extremely important, and being able to have trust. Transparency, which, came up a lot in my proposal, but it also came up in some conversations yesterday. Being very open and transparent about what you're bringing, what you're hoping to gain, and throughout that whole process. And then communication. We haven't explicitly said that, but in order for a partnership to thrive, you need to be able to constantly communicate as you're developing your partnership, you're ongoing through your partnership. Fostering that communication with the right individuals is extremely important. And so I see sometimes those hurdles standing up because messages aren't being, delivered to all of the right people in the part of the partnership, and can cause a road bump.
Great, thank you. So, James, would you like to?
Thank you, good morning, and thanks for those excellent examples, which for me illustrate somehow a fourth point, which is often forgotten, that each partner does what they know to do best. UPS is a logistic company, so bring to the table that you know to do logistics. WHO is a coordinating agency, so we shouldn't do the logistic, but we should do the coordination. And I think all your examples very well illustrated that we should get away from private sector doing what public sector does better, and vice versa, but each one bringing to the table what they know to do best. You mentioned, and there comes my question, that from pilot to scale, I would add the third element to mainstream. And my question is, from all those examples, is any of those going to mainstream it donor independent? Because ultimately, We have to pilot, we have to scale. This is donor-driven, but at some point we have to have a market solution where either regular government resources or market resources, but how do we get it to mainstream?
Great question. Mona, do you have a question? I might gather a few questions at once and give the panel an opportunity to respond.
My question is actually very, very similar. It was directed to Jim because I've heard this example of Zipline, UPS, and MOH in Rwanda a few times now, just a couple of weeks ago at the DevEx event in San Francisco, where Dr. Agnes was also present, the former Minister of Health, and I understood there was a significant investment from the government of Rwanda in this effort. But I guess I wanted to hear a little bit more specifically from you, but also the others around just the sustainability of the approach. And what I see is really the beauty of public-private collaboration is that potential for scale and sustainability.
Great, thank you. I'll take one more from Brian and then I'll turn to the panel to respond.
Thanks. Thanks very much. My question's to Amanda. I'm fascinated by this concept that you've got and recognizing, I think, that the lack of information systems in health is one of the biggest weaknesses of the health system in general. And so you're really doing really important work to try to improve that. What I'm interested to know is there are lots of entities out there with bright digital solutions in the health space. Are you able to match these people up to places of need in developing countries? Because so often my experience is governments will say, not invented here, we don't want your solution, we're going to develop it ourselves. And it takes years and years and years and buckets of money and nothing happens. So if you can match new solutions with areas of need, that would be a great help.
Great, thank you. So 3 good questions there, and I might just go down the line here. So we have a question on how do we mainstream and where are we on that? How do we make these partnerships sustainable? What does that take and what does it look like? And a particular question around how do we bring new products that developed outside country, particularly into country, and get that government collaboration fixed?
I'll address the questions from the front there. The story of the drones, and this has been, I call it the shiny object. It's being shouted around all over the place for many years, but this actually has an intent, because it really only solves like 1/10 of the supply chain when you think about it. But our objective has been, we needed to demonstrate in this space, working with a strong partner like Gavi, that there is a way we can collaborate. And while that project's been running, we're running 2 other initiatives. One is developed and implementing a training program that's meant for mid-level management people to help them gain capacity building and understand supply chains. And then parallel to that is a final mile solution. We're working in Uganda in a collaboration with the Ministry of Government, the Ministry, the NMS, that actually delivers from district centers to health centers, the most complicated part of the supply chain. And our objective is that we want to show all 3 of these things happening independently and then pull them back together again is the strategy, which is when you combine a private sector capability for final mile using the assets, the visibility, the technology, the coordination with drones that offset that with capacity building, then you have the ability to stand everything up and actually deploy it across many countries. So it has to work with the collaboration, it has to work with the commitment. The Rwandan government's done a great job of managing that. They're the ones that sets the pace on when the next site gets opened. They're the one that sets the pace on what's the next SKU we put on, because they know their capacity. We're anxious to put vaccines in since it's a Gavi-sponsored approach, but they're the ones that set the control, and we're okay with that. Impatient, but we're okay with that. So I think that's been our best example so far.
Please.
Great questions. So I'm going to take actually Gaudin's and Mona's questions together, if I might. I know that USAID now, the message from USAID, from Mark Green, is to talk about the journey to self-reliance and how to support countries, how to work with countries towards countries having self-sustained programming and so forth. With these neglected tropical diseases, a term which, you know, is quite difficult to unpick. I much prefer the term diseases of neglected people, because that's really the situation today. Most of these are no longer, even in the poorest countries, these are no longer diseases of the middle classes. These are the diseases of the poor. They are on the way out. And that's great news, because sustainability becomes less of a question than how do you deal with them. And that's a big piece of I think where you go with these diseases. But that said, there are some pieces that are necessarily sustainable, and I would make a plea here that we often overlook the value of the regional roles. We often overlook the value of the kind of systems that Amanda was talking about as monitoring that things have really gone away, or monitoring that things aren't coming back, whichever way you like to look at it. And so those systems need to be sustained. So the idea of having a sustained regional centre in Africa funded by African governments makes complete sense. And I just want to, my mentor Soji yesterday, in his inimitable style, was talking about what matters is what you benchmark things against. And people often say to me, "Oh, African Union, that's a bit of a mess. That's not working really well." And I say, "Please, let's compare it to the European Union." Right? And then the discussion takes a rather different turn. And I'm Scottish, so I'm not a Brexiteer, by the way. But the point is that getting countries to work together, to collaborate, isn't a straightforward thing. But that's a key, I think, to sustainability too.
I actually would like to also address Bruno's question about sustainability and how we look at that in the digital health space. It's a little bit different. We have seen such a shift in the past decade of capacity being built in LMICs to develop these systems, to use data, to implement these systems. And I think continuing to invest in that capacity development, so we don't have to have technologists or developers come from the West, go in and build the systems. Most of these are open source, so the code can be taken and they can build them themselves, and we're seeing that. The Tanzania Data Lab has been stood up for about 2 years at the University of Dar es Salaam. Actually, this is kind of a funny story. I helped set that up, and then a year or two later, I went to a drone training at the Tanzania Data Lab, and it was fantastic to go as a participant and see how that program has evolved. We're seeing a lot of iHubs standing up in countries and innovation platforms. And actually, just later this month, Digital Square is working with the WHO and ITU on a capacity building and training program for digital health, looking at development, governance, and data use. And this will be happening. It's a 2-week training. So that's, I think sustainability is a long road for digital health, but really focusing on that local capacity building is where we see a lot of wins in the digital health space. To respond to your question about matching the need with innovation, we at PATH as a whole really support our country governments. What systems are those that you need? We can advise on systems, but if they've chosen a system that they want, we support them to implement that system. We ensure that all of the digital systems are aligned with policy and strategy. A lot of country governments are now starting to develop e-health strategies. Mm-hmm. Some, they're second versions of e-health strategies. These barely existed a decade ago. But really, you're going to have these innovative things pop up. And I do not want to stifle innovation on these small things, but we advocate that they're standards-based so that they could be made interoperable with some of these larger systems. So if you have data coming in through this small app here, just make sure it can be pushed out and shared to the national HMIS or to some other system where it needs to go. Supply chain is one of the more complex logistic management information systems that we see in our space, and one that we're actively involved in. And a lot of innovation is there, but making sure they're adhering to GS1 standards, and that, again, the right data is being produced. I think we see just one more comment on the systems. There's still a lot of paper being used. And so as we're transforming to these digital systems, making sure we do that transformation and then capture the right data, because all of a sudden you're going from having no data, because there's really not much analysis you can do in a paper system, to having a plethora of data, and being able to train people, being able to build capacity in using the data to make informed decisions is something that we focus on a lot.
Thank you. Jessica, I can see your tent card, Bruce there, and then I think Benjamin, do you have a question also?
These are excellent examples to stimulate discussion this morning. Thank you. It occurs to me that listening to you all that there are potential even broader applications for the kinds of work that you're doing. And I was interested, for example, with Jim Coughlin's presentation. Could you imagine the technology or the, really it's the distribution system and the innovation that you and Zipline have developed to apply it outside lower and middle income countries, even to rural distributed areas in the US, it could be very useful. So I was interested if you see a potential to sort of trickle up like that.
Bruce? Oh, well, we'll gather a few. Bruce, would you like to?
I just had to make sure I asked a question because I'm part of this table.
You guys get extra points at the end.
Really, the question is fairly simple, and the premise is I think the global health story is one that still needs some greater strength to be told in ways that it's well understood. So I'd like to just take that down the level. I think the innovations like yesterday's panel at the end of the day, what we're hearing this morning, there's a lot of great sort of, there's great storytelling that could actually stimulate a lot more interest and build what I would say is the energy for greater commitments to show how those innovations are actually aligned with better health outcomes, people's lives improved, and on it goes. So to the panel, how do we get the storylines and the narratives in really understandable ways that stimulate greater innovation and tie that to the success in terms of health outcomes?
Okay, great, thank you. And then Benjamin, and I think there's one from a gentleman in the back, and that's probably all we have time for.
Okay, my question goes to Amanda and Jim. Let me start with Jim. Is to do with the zip line. So basically, some of these engagements and or rather these partnerships, there must be some business models. So what business model is in place as far as the whole initiative is concerned? Who pays for that particular service? Is it the government? And the question I usually see a lot when you're trying to engage in these partnerships is what's in there for me? What's in there for UPS? What's in there for Gavi and the other partners? Are there also other back office partners? Because, I mean, the drones will require like a telco company or other organizations to enable them to sort of like use the infrastructure. Then for Amanda, it's all about trust and the issues to do with IP. How do you manage that? I mean, I work for a telco company, and we tend to get a lot of concerns when we act as a platform, and the people come up with ideas. They want to leverage on the already existing infrastructure of our organization, but in most cases, we require a broker for them to trust us, because the first thing they have in mind is that once I share this idea with a company like Safaricom, they're going to take the idea and run with it. How do you manage that?
Great questions. And then just one more from the back here.
Thank you. Wonderful examples. This question's more for James. So with the introduction of any new technology in health, there's a wonderful 2x2 matrix that we use, which is high cost and low cost, and high impact and low impact. And our sweet spot is always low cost and high impact when it comes to new intervention. So it's interesting how a lot of the innovations are technology based, which are high cost interventions. And I wondered if you had any data, because I think that's one of the most convincing things, the evidence and the cost effectiveness of it. Any data on how the cost per unit, for example, has reduced with this sort of distribution mechanism and using this technology, and perhaps projections on how we can achieve economies of scale and scope by introducing new products or commodities that can be distributed, and antiretrovirals or anti-malarials, for example, come to mind.
Great, thank you. So, Jim, I might turn to you first, as you've got quite a few to answer to here.
Sure. I guess the first, I want to kind of start in the end because I think it ties back to the earlier questions. When I first entered in this space, I remember going to a meeting here in DC with USAID, and people were asking me, how does UPS, when they meet with their commercial clients, how do you work with optimizing your supply chain? What are the tools? What are the elements of what success looks like? And I started right away talking about cost of inventory and inventory holding costs. And someone leaned over from the Gates organization and said, "It's donated, Jim, there's no cost here." So I quickly realized that the whole model, to your point, kind of goes out the window, right? Because there really is no value associated with the donated goods that are sitting in warehouses, sometimes 10, 20, 50, when they burn or when they don't burn. It's still sitting there as inventory, correct? So what we have to do is kind of put some elements on other values associated with this until you get enough data so you can start to teach the method of how do you manage the supply chain, because warehouses aren't supposed to exist in a supply chain. The product's supposed to keep moving at all times. But this desire to measure stockouts and not having any stockouts at all has a tendency to give you more demand for warehousing and more demand for products sitting still rather than getting to the patients. So these tests that we're doing both in Uganda as well as in Rwanda and a few other locations, we're trying to work with other partners like CHI, USAID, UNICEF, and a few others that help. They're the ones that do the baseline, and they're the ones that also designing what it is that are some of the elements associated with the impact. So that when we come back with the story that someone asked earlier, there's some credibility to the story. It's not just UPS giving another video about a drone, but it's really an initiative across multiple partners. And in this next phase of Uganda, we have USAID and Global Fund coming on board to start look at their commodities and see if we can add that to the final mile, which starts to teach about density and putting that vehicle to use for not just the vaccines, but for all commodities and essential medicines, because we also want to get the established methodology of vehicles should be utilized 100%, not just sitting idle, and how do you get that same delivery stop to service multiple partners. So that's company initiatives and some of the scale we're looking to do. When it comes to what's in it for us, from the innovation, sir, it's about, I think we have an obligation to help bring some of this capability to the market. We also understand that we can create some of our own capabilities in Africa, which we don't have today. So I think the question was raised earlier about Merck, how Merck does some of that sometimes to go out there and use the marketplace to learn, and whether that demonstrates future opportunities, we don't know, but I think working with partners like Gavi, we can start to learn that space a little better.
Great, thank you. Amanda, I'll turn to you next and then to you, Donald.
Sure. So I want to address your question about trust and how to manage that and the brokering process. And I have a good example because I worked on a project a number of years ago with a mobile network operator that failed. And I think one of the reasons that project failed is we didn't have a very good understanding of each other's constraints. So having that be very frank and part of the discussion. And one of the problems that we face on the NGO side is we're constrained by the time schedule of our project. So we have to meet this deliverable, we have to get this thing done by X amount of time. So we need to have a very honest conversation about what we have time to actually do. And we also need to message to our funding partners that these innovations take time. So very short funding cycles are not going to lend themselves well when you want to innovate with multi-sectoral partners, and that just honestly takes time to build trust and time for those communications.
Donald, I'll let you respond to whichever of these questions you like. However, I did want to make sure we hit on Bruce's question of how do we get this out there?
Sure. So I'd love to take on Bruce's question, but I want to provoke a question to Jim first, if that's okay. Because this is Jessica's question, which we've been ignoring. So Jessica had asked about what's the relevance of, for example, of zipline type things in rural USA. My son is a doctor in what's called the Highlands and Islands of Scotland. And they have exactly the same problem. You know, I mean, people 2 hours on a ferry to get to people, all this sort of thing. So have these sorts of technologies been applied in rich countries?
So, sorry, microphone's still on. We still have an engineering and IT department within UPS, the parent, that's looking at all the different technology through AI and UASs that can serve some of our commercial needs. Because similar to what you described in some of the rural settings, there are also demands that go out to islands, sometimes off the coast, and that requires a different transportation vehicle, whether it's a boat or something else. So we are looking at that for commercial purposes. Part of the challenge in the marketplace today is that there's a lot of good innovation, but not a lot of organizations have actually got to the point where they've implemented and actually executing on UAS solutions. And that's why Zipline continues to drive the attention it does, at least in the African continent, because it actually is doing a good job in delivering on its commitment, and it's built a supply chain solution, not just a drone solution. So I think that distinguishes them, and not just because they're my partner, but also because I get that question asked a lot. Why do you keep leaning on Zipline? Show me somebody else that can do it. We'll be glad to talk to them, right?
Just add to that real quickly. So just to add to the conversation, Merck has actually been working with AT&T, Direct Relief International, a company called Volanzai, and several other partners to look at the use of drone delivery in disaster situations. So these are pilots we just started several weeks back. There are FAA regulations in the U.S. That complicate this delivery, but it is something that we're looking at, thinking about what happened in Puerto Rico and the challenges we had in getting medicines into Puerto Rico to address that situation. So we should probably talk.
We already are. We're working with Merck for Mothers, and Brian and the team, Brian Thornley, are involved with the drone collaboration. We're showing what we have, and they're showing what you have done in Switzerland.
Okay.
So we already have some good activities going on.
Okay, good.
through Mary
I might
Ann.
also put somebody on my team in touch with
That's
you.
great.
Okay,
Thank you.
great.
Okay, Donald, if you wrap us up on how do we get the message out there, and then I'll ask each of you for your tweetable comments, which seems to be the thing to do. And then we have a workshop for you right after this.
Okay. You know, the first program I talked about, the OCP program, the Onchocerciasis Control Program, was about spraying larvicide from helicopters. It was just after the Vietnam War.
Oh.
And that's where the helicopters came from. That's where the helicopter pilots came from. A lot of them were unemployed, right? And so, right, okay. I didn't want to provoke a further discussion on this, but that's right. But that's who it was. When we used to talk about that program, just like Jim started off with a, totally wow, here's a plane taking off that's carrying blood picture, you could just show helicopters shooting down rivers in West Africa, getting rid of this disease. It was very dramatic and people were really interested. The storylines we have today about pills and so forth are not like that. And whereas the high-tech things, and I've noticed most of the questions, responses are to the high-tech things, and I also, in my working life, I recognize that it's intrinsically interesting, and particularly for billionaires, in my experience, that's how it goes. But these stories about people taking pills and living in difficult places to get to and things, those stories are much less headline grabbing. And in fact, to tell those stories, you actually have to care about what's happening to the people. You have to take time to get into the story. And then people really are interested. People care about these things. And they really care to see programs that work and people in need getting those needs satisfied. Those are stories that work very well. So my answer is that unfortunately, I don't think there's a quick fix to this. This is PBS series. This is the kind of material. This is the kind of way we have to think about it because it takes time to get people involved and engaged into these stories. And of course, donors don't like paying for that.
Great, thank you. So Amanda, wrap us up with your tweetable takeaway.
I think we have to live that African proverb. We go faster alone, but further together. So we really need to embrace true collaboration to do this. We need to dare to launch innovative partnerships, and we need to harness transparency.
Thank you. Donald?
I would just say working together works well.
Very nice. And Jim.
Because it's achievable, don't accept no, find the yes.
That's a good one. Okay, folks, please join me in thanking our panel for their insights.